December 12, 1942. Ames, Iowa. Snow pressed against the darkened windows of a low concrete laboratory guarded by armed Navy sentries who did not wear unit patches. Inside, beneath the steady vibration of aging furnaces and the sharp smell of burning flux, Daniel Mercer stood alone over a glowing slab of metal that was not supposed to exist. Outside, the world spoke in headlines of sinking convoys and shattered fleets. Inside, the war had narrowed to a single question of heat, pressure, and forbidden chemistry. Please subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends to support our work. Mercer was not a military man. His hands were those of a scholar, scarred by acids and heat rather than recoil and gunfire. Officially, he was a civilian consultant assigned to a materials study for the new generation of American battleships. Unofficially, he was doing something far more dangerous. He was resurrecting an alloy that Navy inspectors had buried years before the war began, a metal classified as unstable, unpredictable, too risky for mass production. The files were stamped rejected. The margins were filled with warnings. Mercer had read every line in silence and had seen something none of the reviewing boards had allowed themselves to see. The failures were rushed. The cooling cycles were wrong. The tests were hurried by budget cycles and peacetime caution. Now the world was no longer at peace. Across the Pacific, steel met steel with murderous speed. The Navy demanded armor that could survive shells weighing more than a small truck. The pressure was constant. Reports arrived weekly. Hulls breached. Decks torn open. Men lost because the armor had failed by inches. For the new flagship of the Atlantic Fleet, the massive hull of the USS Iowa was already taking shape in distant shipyards. Thicker steel was the Navy's answer. Predictable steel. Observable steel. Mercer believed predictable steel would not be enough. The alloy he pursued was different. It was not simply stronger. It behaved differently under extreme impact. Nickel, chromium, molybdenum, and trace elements sat in ratios that violated every Navy materials handbook. More dangerous still was the heat treatment. Mercer's method required an uneven cooling gradient that deliberately introduced internal stress before relieving it in stages. The engineers who had tested the method in the 1930s called it reckless. The inspectors called it uncontrollable. Mercer called it misunderstood. The first full-scale plate was poured in late November. It cooled too quickly. The metal screamed as it contracted. Hairline fractures raced across its surface like frozen lightning. Navy officers watched from behind protective glass, their faces set with impatience. The verdict was immediate. Project termination. The money was needed elsewhere. Convoys were dying in the Atlantic. Experiments had no place in a war of desperation. Mercer was ordered to shut down the alloy work and return to standardized armor research. On paper, he complied. But at night, long after the sentries changed shifts and the furnaces cooled to dull red, Mercer remained. He adjusted the cooling sequence by seconds. He altered one trace element that was not listed anywhere in the Navy's approved materials registry. It was a violation that could have ended his career, possibly worse. If the new mixture failed catastrophically under test conditions, it would be his name in every security file. Yet Mercer proceeded with the quiet certainty of a man who believed that delay would cost more lives than disobedience. The second plate was poured in silence and hidden in a crate marked only with a shipment code that did not exist in any ledger. 3 weeks later, at a proving ground hundreds of miles away, the unmarked crate arrived without explanation. No paperwork accompanied it. No signature authorized it. It was simply unloaded and placed beside standard test plates. The officials supervising the firing assumed it was another control sample from one of the approved mills. No one questioned it. Paperwork in wartime often lagged behind reality. The loading crew prepared a full-scale armor-piercing round. 2,700 pounds of hardened steel and explosive filler were winched into the test gun with slow, tedious care. The wind cut across the range. Spotters checked their instruments. High-speed cameras were armed. No one expected anything unusual. The gun fired. The shell struck the plate dead center with a sound that was not quite an impact and not quite an explosion. It was sharper than steel on steel. Brief. Almost hollow. When the smoke cleared, the impossible had occurred. The shell had shattered. Its hardened cap lay twisted on the concrete apron. Fragments were embedded in the surrounding berms. The plate itself had deformed inward several inches and then rebounded. It had not been pierced. Silence followed, a kind of silence that felt heavier than any blast. Technicians stared at their instruments, convinced they had misread something. The firing crew recalibrated the gun. A second shell was loaded. The wind shifted. The observers braced. The second shot struck within inches of the first. The result did not change. Someone ordered the test halted immediately. Far from the proving ground, on that same afternoon in Iowa, Daniel Mercer stood alone in his dark lab, staring at a cooling furnace that suddenly felt colder than it should have. He did not yet know the test had succeeded. He only knew, with the unease that comes before revelation, that something irreversible had just happened. Before the next phase of this hidden story unfolds, if you're enjoying uncovering secrets like this from the darkest corners of World War II, please share, like, comment, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends so you never miss stories that history tried to bury. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from around the world. Your voices keep these forgotten moments alive. Within 48 hours of the test, the alloy's designation vanished from every open registry. The Navy issued a quiet classification order. The formula was sealed. The firing data disappeared into a restricted archive. The official explanation credited improvements in heat treatment of standard armor steel. No mention was made of ultra-trace elements. No mention was made of Mercer. He was summoned to a windowless briefing room 2 days later. 3 officers were present. Their uniforms bore no identifying insignia beyond rank. They informed him that his unauthorized work had saved the Navy months of development time. They also informed him that he would never again reference the alloy in any form. Not in publications. Not in lectures. Not even in his private correspondence. The material was now classified above his clearance level. The final instruction was delivered without malice and without room for appeal. The forbidden metal did not officially exist. Neither did his role in its creation. The USS Iowa continued to take shape along the cutting lines of distant shipyards, its massive plates riveted and welded without any outward sign that they were different from the thousands of tons of armor that had come before. Sailors assigned to the battleship trained without knowing what lay beneath their feet. They trusted the steel because they had always trusted steel. Mercer returned to his approved duties. He analyzed samples. He wrote reports. He watched standardized steel fail in predictable ways under predictable forces. He also watched casualty lists grow longer. Months later, the Iowa slipped into active service under full naval secrecy. Its armor met no ceremonial test. Its skin would be proven only in combat. What Mercer did not know was that intelligence officers on the other side of the war were already studying fragments recovered from failed shell impacts. They compared hardness values. They compared deformation patterns. They found discrepancies they could not explain. And somewhere in a foreign analysis cell, a quiet note was recorded that would one day return to haunt everything Mercer thought he had hidden. The resistance was inconsistent with known American steel. The forbidden alloy had survived its first test. It had entered the war silently, and the world was about to learn that something beneath the surface of American armor had changed in ways no one could publicly admit. The storm was no longer outside the laboratory. It was inside the steel itself. If you love stories like this, real courage, real history, then don't just watch, become part of it. Subscribe now to WW2 Frontline Legends and stand with the people who keep this history alive. Every like, every share, every comment helps us honor those who lived these moments and shows your support for the hard work that goes into bringing these forgotten stories back to life. So hit that subscribe button, join our community, and tell us where you're watching from. Together, we're not just remembering history, we're keeping it alive. The foreign memo traveled through hidden channels and cipher desks long before it ever reached American hands. It moved quietly, translated by tired cryptographers who had spent years decoding fragments of fear and steel. Most intelligence reports were cluttered with speculation and error. This one was different. It was precise, clinical, terrifying in its restraint. It did not exaggerate. It simply stated that repeated modeling of battleship-class armor had failed to match observed results. The resistance coefficient did not obey known American metallurgical behavior. The implication was unmistakable. Something in the steel itself had changed. By the time the analysis reached the upper levels of naval intelligence, the USS Iowa was already cutting through Atlantic swells on active assignment. To the sailors on her decks, she was just another ship of war, immense, fast, bristling with firepower. They trusted her armor because they were supposed to. None of them knew that their survival now rested in part on a formula that did not officially exist. The Navy treated the intercepted memo as a potential counterintelligence trap. If the enemy truly understood that the armor was abnormal, then the secrecy surrounding the alloy had already failed. Investigators were ordered to trace every access point connected to the test program. Shipping records, furnace logs, personnel rotations. Every man and woman who had come near that crate was quietly flagged. Daniel Mercer never received notification that he was under review. The questions came instead in the form of routine inquiries, polite interviews, baseline verifications, standard paperwork that carried the weight of invisible suspicion. Each time, Mercer answered with careful precision. He gave nothing beyond what was already on file. His hands never shook. His voice never lifted. Yet the longer the review continued, the more he understood that the alloy was no longer merely classified. It was now dangerous. The missing notebook pages were discovered in early spring during an otherwise ordinary security audit. Mercer's laboratory records were reviewed against archive copies. Several weeks of experimental notes were absent. Not redacted. Removed entirely. No burn marks. No torn bindings. Simply gone. No order authorizing their removal could be found. The question of who had taken them was never officially posed to Mercer. But folders began to circulate in rooms he could not enter. Hypotheses multiplied without his participation. Had an overzealous security officer seized them? Had Mercer destroyed them himself? Or had someone else, someone unseen, intervened first? From that moment forward, Mercer's life narrowed again. His research assignments shifted away from ballistics and toward corrosion resistance and stress fatigue. Work that mattered, but not in ways that could shape the war. The forbidden alloy had become a ghost project, known to exist, untouchable, unrepeatable. Across the ocean, the Iowa faced her first true bombardment in heavy northern seas. Enemy shells rose in desperate salvos against her moving walls of steel. Some struck glancing blows. Others hit full and direct. The armor groaned. It flared. It held. Damaged parties moved with stunned urgency as fragments ricocheted across decks. Yet the penetrations that analysts had predicted did not occur. Each impact deepened the mystery. On the enemy side, the frustration became acute. Shell designs were adjusted. Hardness was increased. Penetrator caps were reshaped. Firing tables were revised. Yet simulation after simulation failed to explain why the Iowa and her class absorbed punishment that should have crippled them. The math did not work. The steel behaved as if it were something else entirely. Someone in that foreign analysis cell finally spoke what others feared. The Americans had altered their armor at a structural level. Not surface treatment. Not thickness. Structure. That realization triggered a new phase of the war that would never appear in history books. Back in Iowa, Mercer felt the weight of invisible attention settle into his days. His phone calls were oddly brief. His correspondence arrived already opened. Colleagues avoided extended conversations in hallways. The war had trained people well in the art of silence. He did not protest. He worked. He waited. Late one evening, Long after most technicians had gone home, a man appeared at the threshold of Mercer's lab without knocking. He wore civilian clothing, but moved with military discipline. He introduced himself only by last name and rank he was not wearing. The visitor spoke in the soft cadence of authority that did not require volume. He told Mercer that the enemy was attempting to reverse engineer the Iowa's armor from recovered fragments. He told Mercer that certain analytical markers in the steel could eventually expose the forbidden alloy's composition. And then he told Mercer the sentence that shifted everything. If the enemy succeeded, the advantage would not vanish. It would invert. Mercer understood instantly. An alloy that could shatter armor-piercing shells could also be adapted into penetrators that no standard armor could stop. The same structural rebound that saved American sailors could one day be used to kill them. The forbidden alloy was no longer only a shield. It was a potential sword. The visitor did not ask for Mercer's opinion. He delivered an instruction. Mercer was to resume alloy work under new authorization. But this time, he was not to strengthen the formula. He was to weaken it intentionally, to introduce false analogs, to generate decoys, metallurgical shadows that could be leaked without revealing the true structure of the original alloy. Mercer was being asked to engineer deception at the atomic level. The moral weight of the task pressed on him in ways no test firing ever had. If he succeeded, he would mislead enemy science for years. If he failed, he could accidentally teach them how to defeat his own creation. The visitor left without offering guidance on which risk the Navy considered acceptable. The Shadow Laboratory was established in a converted industrial basement outside the city. There would be no sentries here, no official logs. Only Mercer, a handful of young metallurgists who were told nothing of the true purpose, and furnaces that burned at hours when no schedules recorded them. They produced plate after plate that almost behaved like the forbidden alloy, but not quite. Some shattered too easily. Others absorbed too much energy and cracked inward. Each failure was catalogued with care. Over weeks, patterns formed. Mercer learned which weaknesses were most convincing. He crafted metals that would seduce an analyst into believing they were close to the real breakthrough. The intent was not to stop reverse engineering. It was to guide it into dead ends that would consume years. While deception took shape on land, the Iowa continued to trade blows at sea. The shell impacts grew heavier. The ranges closed. Enemy gunnery improved. Yet the outcomes remained stubbornly inconsistent with expectation. Some shells flattened without piercing. Others fragmented on contact. Damage reports recorded deformations no standard alloy should survive. The Navy quietly reduced casualty forecasts for the ship. No one told the crew why. Then, in the quiet hours before dawn one spring morning, another intelligence package reached American hands. It was thinner than the first, more controlled. It contained one line that carried more weight than any data table. The enemy believed they had isolated the alloy's core principle. Mercer read the summary weeks later in a secured briefing room with the same 3 officers who had once ordered him into silence. The report described a foreign alloy that shared surface hardness traits with his own creation. It was the first sign that the deception program might be working, or it might be failing catastrophically. If the enemy had truly grasped the structural rebound mechanism, then the race was already lost. If they had instead followed one of Mercer's engineered dead paths, then the race was only beginning. There was no way to know which was true. The war moved toward its final violent years under that uncertainty. Steel answered steel across oceans. The Iowa was struck again and again. She survived each engagement with damage that baffled analysts. Each survival reinforced the legend of American industrial might. Few would ever suspect that her armor was not simply strong. It was different in ways no public blueprint could describe. Mercer's health began to fail under the unrelenting strain. The heat of the furnaces aged him faster than the calendar. His hair thinned. His hands trembled when he tried to rest them. Yet he returned each night, driven by the fear that one imperfect decoy formula might reveal everything. Then, without warning, his invisible visitor returned. This time the message was not cautious. It was urgent. A foreign weapons test had achieved partial penetration against armor believed to mimic Iowa-class steel. The data suggested the enemy was closing on a functional countermeasure. Whether it was true replication or the consequence of Mercer's own intentional weaknesses could not yet be determined. The forbidden alloy was no longer hidden behind locked files and sealed crates. It was now part of an accelerating contest between laboratories that would never publicly acknowledge one another. Mercer understood then that the war's final years would not be decided only by ships and shells. They would be decided by equations. And somewhere within those equations, his own work had become both the shield and the vulnerability upon which thousands of lives still depended. By the winter of 1945, the war had shifted from desperate uncertainty into a grinding certainty of approaching collapse. Shipyards still worked through frozen nights. Intelligence desks still glowed with coded traffic. And beneath all of it, beneath the thunder of guns and the roar of engines, the quiet war of equations continued to race toward an invisible finish line. Daniel Mercer now walked with a slight stiffness in his back, a trace left by years of leaning over furnaces that never truly cooled. His hands, once steady even above liquid metal, sometimes betrayed him when he tried to pour a careful sample. The hidden laboratory still burned each night, its glow swallowed by industrial brick and secrecy. Decoy alloys continued to flow from its molds, each one designed to resemble the forbidden metal closely enough to deceive, but never closely enough to reveal. The intelligence briefings grew darker as the months passed. Foreign weapons tests had begun to show patterns that were no longer dismissed as coincidence. Shell fragments recovered from distant proving grounds displayed rebound characteristics eerily similar to those seen on the armor of the USS Iowa. The line between coincidence and comprehension thinned with every packet of data. Mercer understood the terrible balance now at play. If the enemy had truly grasped the structural principle, then the forbidden alloy was no longer a singular advantage. It was the opening move of a future conflict that might surface years later under different flags and different skies. If, however, what they had achieved was only a reflection of his planted weaknesses, then the deception was working and lives were still being quietly saved. No one could yet tell which truth was winning. In January, Mercer received his final directive. The decoy program was to be wound down. The war was nearing its end. Resources were being shifted toward reconstruction planning and new tiers of weapons development. His hidden furnaces would cool for good. His remaining samples were to be surrendered for sealed storage. Not destruction, storage. The difference mattered more than any official admitted. He spent his last night in the shadow lab alone. The furnaces were powered down one by one. The silence that followed felt heavier than any blast he had ever heard. He moved slowly through the rows of molds and scarred workbenches, touching surfaces as if committing their textures to memory. Every flaw in the metal around him told a story of trial, error, and risk that could never be published. When he reached the final sample, a flawed decoy alloy plate that had come dangerously close to the true forbidden formula, he hesitated longer than he should have. For a moment, temptation whispered. With a slight change, a shift no one might notice, he could preserve the real secret in a fragment that might one day be rediscovered. He pictured a future engineer, decades later, staring at anomalous data with the same wonder he once felt in a sealed pre-war archive. For a heartbeat, history wavered. Then Mercer turned the furnace on one last time and returned the plate to molten anonymity. When the war ended, it did so in blinding flashes and sudden silence. Parades filled streets that had known blackout curtains for years. Sailors returned with stories no civilian language could easily contain. The Iowa survived the war with scars that became points of pride. Her armor told its own story in dented steel and warped structures that never breached. No one who walked her decks ever learned why. Mercer vanished into civilian life without announcement. No farewell briefing. No ceremony. No acknowledgement in any journal. His security clearance lapsed quietly. His laboratory access expired with the stroke of a pen. The forbidden alloy returned fully to the realm of ghosts. Years later, scattered engineers attempted to make sense of Iowa-class armor using only publicly available data. Their models failed. Simulations broke down under conditions where the ship had clearly survived. Conferences debated the discrepancy. Some proposed exotic heat treatments. Others speculated about unknown trace elements. None approached the real formula closely enough to recognize its shadow. Mercer watched these debates from a distance, sometimes from the back row of obscure technical symposiums, sometimes through the thin pages of specialist publications. He never corrected them. He never hinted. Silence had become his final assignment. The missing notebook pages were never recovered. Government archivists filed conflicting accounts of their disappearance. Some records implied a sealed transfer order that referenced no destination. Others suggested they were removed during a late wartime purge of sensitive material. A few hinted at simple clerical destruction. The contradictions themselves became part of the mystery. Each explanation canceled another. And so the forbidden alloy lived on not as an object, but as an absence. Mercer aged quietly. His health declined in measured steps. The rhythm of industrial life that had once anchored his days faded into the softer ticking of domestic hours. Yet even as his body weakened, his mind remained alert to every news fragment that brushed near the edges of advanced weapons development. Whenever armor resistance appeared in foreign research in ways that defied older models, a familiar unease stirred. Had someone finally found the real path? One autumn evening, many years after the guns had fallen silent, Mercer sat alone in the small apartment where he had chosen to spend his last years. The window was open just enough to admit cool air and distant city noise. On the table beside him lay a stack of old journals and yellowed notes that contained nothing classified, but everything personal. They were remnants of a life that history would never fully record. A stray cat padded softly through the open window. It was thin, gray, cautious, marked with the scars of street survival. It regarded Mercer with the same wary curiosity that he once held for unfamiliar metals. Neither moved for a long moment. Then, slowly, the cat stepped closer, drawn by warmth and the faint smell of tea. Mercer smiled faintly and extended a trembling hand. The cat allowed the touch. In that quiet room, far from furnaces and proving grounds, the man who had altered the fate of warships through invisible structures sat in silence with a creature that knew nothing of alloys, shells, or secrecy. The world outside continued to rebuild itself without awareness of what had been hidden beneath its victories. Somewhere in sealed vaults, plates of forbidden steel still rested beneath layers of classification and dust. Somewhere in naval hulls, echoes of impossible shell impacts still slept beneath paint and decades of refitting. The alloy remained unspoken, unclaimed, and unreplicated. And the question that had followed Mercer through every year of silence still lingered without resolution. Was the forbidden alloy truly lost forever? Or was it simply waiting? Please share, like, comment, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends to get more hidden stories like this. It truly means everything to us. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from around the world. I read every message, and your support keeps these forgotten moments alive.